Andrew, that's right. I had it at the tip of my tongue.
All right. Afternoon, everyone. So here we go. So we're going to have a bit of a look at the signs of the times. Everything's good now. We've sorted this corona stuff out, so life's going to be awesome. And we go back to rainbows and unicorns, or not. So we'll go through a few things, world events and current affairs, I suppose, and how that aligns with God's word and what we see indicated in the Bible. Various nations are mentioned. This is, I suppose, a disclaimer at the start. I'm not making any specific comments on them, their politics, or their people. There's lots of people from different heritages and nationalities around, and they don't all necessarily agree with what their governments do or what their countries are doing. And I suppose at the end of the day, God will work the nations how he sees fit, just like whether you're on Team Egypt or Team Persia back in the day. I suppose, God made things happen. And also, I suppose we want to be mindful of not particularly taking pleasure in the pain, suffering and torment that we see people having in their lives as we see these events. We, I suppose, note the events and what that may mean, but I suppose we're not having a party every time something bad happens in the world because we think the Lord's closer, and that's awesome. All right. So this is, for those who are on the ball, the workout that I've actually combined two passages here. So Matthew 24 and Luke 21. So the disciples asked Jesus, "What shall the sign of thy coming and the end of the world?" And he said unto them, "Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. And there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distresses of nations with perplexity, the sea and waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven shall be shaken." So we'll have a look, largely focusing on some of the events and activities that are mentioned in this passage here. And we can certainly, I think, see some of these appearing day to day as we go. So we've got Mr. Putin and the Russians are currently amassing an almighty number of soldiers on the border with the Ukraine. I don't know if you can see down the bottom corner, there's a few figures talking about 94,000 soldiers, 1,200 tanks, 330 aircraft, 75 warships and 6 submarines just happen to be in and around the Ukraine. To put that in perspective, Australia's military is about 60,000 full-time personnel. So they've only got about double the number of people we have total, just camped out near the Ukraine just in case. We also have 59 tanks, which is a few less than 1,200. So it's probably a good thing we don't live next to Russia. So Ukraine is very interesting politically. It's not currently part of NATO, but it has been promised NATO membership at some magical point in the future, which they haven't decided on yet. Russia, who isn't part of NATO and is fundamentally the reason NATO exists, is pushing very hard for the Ukraine not to be allowed to join NATO. I'm not sure why they think they get a vote at the table for the club that they're not part of, but they're pushing very hard to say Ukraine shouldn't be part of NATO and that NATO should go away and leave the Ukraine to do what it wants to do. Basically, if they become part of NATO, there's a large part of that agreement is that the collective defence of those nations. Basically, if you're part of NATO and someone gets invaded that's also part of NATO, you're signed up to send all your soldiers, Air Force, Navy, basically to support. And obviously that's something Russia's keen not to see happen. So there's a lot of intrigue going both in boots on the ground and in the political realm. And just to throw another spanner in the works, Russia supplies about 30% of Europe's natural gas, and about 16% of that goes through the Ukraine. So if something does kick on, and at the moment they're kind of hinting at maybe January or February if it is going to, because fighting war in the middle of winter is apparently something Russia is keen on. But basically, it puts the European heating system, across all of Europe, the natural gas heating at risk. So you go from it's someone causing problems nowhere near our country to we've now got millions of people unable to turn their heater on when it's zero. So it actually has a massive implication for all of Europe, let alone just the people who live in Ukraine. We've got the satellite wars, and it's interesting looking at the passage which talks about signs in the sun, moon, and in the stars. We've now the battlefield is now entering space, and the stars and the moon. So this is a quote from an American general who basically is in charge of Space Force, which is basically their space army, but Space Force sounds way cooler. So they're currently dealing with a lot of what they call reversible attacks, which are non-kinetic attacks that don't permanently damage their satellites, whether they're military or civilian. And that's things like lasers, radio frequency jammers, and hacking. So basically people causing trouble with the US communication satellites. And he was basically, and they basically pointed the finger at Russia and China. And he wouldn't actually be drawn on whether they'd attacked a military satellite that's done significant damage or whether they're just being hampered in terms of things just not working as well as they should, or whether they're actually breaking bits. But you see there, they're talking about it's now borderline acts of war. And that's a very interesting, I suppose, quote. When you're actively stopping something working, whether you're attacking it or whether you just happen to be looking to see what's there. There is actually a space treaty, 1967. The Outer Space Treaty bans positioning of weapons in outer space and prohibits military activities on celestial bodies, which basically everyone who's in space has signed up to. But it could be very interesting to see how long that holds for, the way things are going, because space is now the place to be. Which leads into this one. So it was in the news, 15th of November, the Russian Ministry of Defence launched an anti-satellite missile, basically blew up an old satellite that they had, just because they could, fundamentally. It destroyed one of their own satellites and actually made a massive cloud of space debris that is now hurtling around the planet at some silly speed. And actually caused the people on the International Space Station to have to go into an emergency kind of hide in the thing that's not going to get destroyed by space junk, because they happen to be in about the same distance from Earth in orbit, so now this stuff's just hurtling around. I think most of it missed the space station, but there's actually Russians on the space station that were put in danger, but they didn't seem too worried by that. So this is the first time anyone has ever actually blown up a satellite. People have launched missiles at satellites to kind of proof of concept them, but they haven't actually blown one up yet. So this was actually the first time anyone's blown up a satellite with a missile, fundamentally. And they dubbed the weapon the Star Warrior. And it can basically, the International Space Station is about 400 k's above Earth, and this thing's got a range of about 800 k's. So there's not much in terms of satellites and things that we've put into space that this thing can't get to. And it's not just military satellites, they can target anything. So you can see here they're talking about if NATO upsets them, they can basically blow global GPS signal out of the sky, literally. So all the military, equipment that runs off GPS, all the planes, all the ships, all the trucks that need, all the missiles that need GPS for targeting and to know where they're going and what they're doing, they can basically shoot that out of the sky if they want to, for the Western world, and then they'll just use their GPS ones, which obviously they won't shoot out of the sky. So that has a bit of a strange impact and can obviously be used on any, you'll lose your Netflix pretty quickly if they start knocking out normal ones. So let's hope there's no lockdowns for those with Netflix. Right, did I skip a page? No. All right, so the next one is looking at the Chinese Navy. So the Chinese have just, or are in the final stages of completing what's fundamentally the largest non-US aircraft carrier to be built for a very long time. So they're saying that China could have 4 aircraft carriers by 2025 and potentially 1 more by 2030. And that basically tips the balance of power in the Pacific for the first time since World War II against the Americans, that China would actually have a more powerful navy than the Americans, which creates all kinds of havoc for the geopolitical system as we know it, because it's not just rely on Team America to go send their ships and the world order will be maintained. They won't actually have the most powerful navy in the Pacific anymore. And China's shipbuilding is going absolutely gangbusters. So there was a satellite image from 2019 of a single Chinese shipyard, and they have multiple shipyards, unlike Australia. But they had 9 destroyers in various stages of construction at a single shipyard. For context, Australia built 3 destroyers total, and we said, job done. So China's just pumping these things out. They're building fleets faster than basically we can build a single ship. And they've certainly got a mission in mind. And to go with their navy increasing, they've also got, if my button works. Can you make my button work, please? There we go. They've also just developed some brand new missiles. And the one at the top right-hand corner happens to be a ship killer missile, which also tips the balance of power. So you can see the coloured rings, how far basically those missiles on the right-hand side can get. So Australia isn't quite on that map, and Australia is basically the very tip at the bottom of the lightest shade. So fundamentally, their new missile can now get to essentially Australian shores. Not quite Australian shores, I don't think, but awfully close. But if you work out where you can now put ships, you've got an aircraft carrier, it's now a long way from where it used to be, where it was safe. It used to be a couple hundred Ks, and it got to maybe 500 Ks, but now it's up to, I don't know if you can quite read it, they're talking about 5,000 Ks kind of range on these missiles that can destroy an entire aircraft carrier in one hit. So again, that's challenging the balance of power. The US can't just sit their aircraft carriers off the Chinese waters and do these freedom of navigation exercises knowing they're safe. They're actually, any ship in those rings is now actually theoretically in danger, which is a big change to the way things are. So, pretty little bridge disappears. And there's a couple more which are, to some extent, more worrying than all the worrying stuff we've just talked about. So, we've got hypersonic missiles. Don't know if you've heard about those in the news recently. So, everybody's trying to develop these. At the moment, the Chinese are a fair way ahead of everyone else. Hypersonic means a lot faster than the speed of sound. So we're talking, if you can read very well, there's some stats up there, but fundamentally we're talking Mach 10, which means 10 times the speed of sound, which is about 12,000 Ks an hour, which is a fair bit. So 3.4 kilometres a second. So using Brad's official Woodcroft unit of measure, being from the hall to junk food junction, this missile will get there in 1 second. That's how fast it's going. So I'm not even sure Eli or the boys have broken that in their cars yet, but something to target, no. But one of the other main differences with these missiles, and you can kind of see in this bottom diagram, is a standard missile goes in a nice big curve, they launch it, it goes up kind of into space and then comes back down. And it's pretty easy to work out where it's going. Once it's kind of set and forget, it's got a dot on a map it's aiming for, and it goes up in a nice big curve and comes back down. So if you're trying to shoot it out of the sky, you know where it's going to be pretty much if you can work out what it's aiming for. The hypersonic ones, I don't know if you can see the other line, the one that does this, is what they can do with the hypersonics. So basically you shoot it up with another missile, the warhead bit of it then detaches up in space, which is that bit, and then you've got this pretty little curve which you can actually manipulate and adjust. So you've got something travelling at 12,000 k's an hour that you can now steer, and it makes it awfully hard to stop. It's a controllable direct trajectory, and the Chinese test that they did recently was the first time they've actually ever managed to launch a hypersonic missile off a hypersonic glide platform. So they can make kind of the carrier bits work, but this is the first time anyone's ever actually shot a missile off the carrier, because they're both going crazy fast when you do it. And there's lots of physics involved and very, very smart people trying to work out how to do bad things. So the hypersonic missile, when they get the carrier up, during the test, it actually went around the whole globe, did a lap, and then it shot off the missile bit, and that landed somewhere in China and missed the theoretical target by about 20 k's. But if it's a glow-in-the-dark missile, it doesn't really matter. 20 k's is within the tolerance of goodbye. So it's basically, they can fly this thing around the whole globe, and then they can launch this thing at 12,000 k's an hour at whatever they want. And the first one they tried was within 20 k's. So that's a pretty scary, I suppose, future for, we looked at those on the previous page where missiles can get to. We've now got a missile that can get anywhere in the world awfully fast. And because they're going so fast, they're also on the very edge of what modern radar and defence systems are able to combat or defeat. Basically, a lot of the world can't actually stop a hypersonic missile if it's coming. So if people start throwing these around, there's going to be a lot of problems. There's basically nothing you can do about it. And they're going so fast that you don't even have time to worry to some extent. And because Ben pulled out pi and some maths, I felt obliged to counter that. So we're now going to derive the equation for the speed of sound, which is on the next... No, we're not going to do that. I fell asleep doing that enough at uni, and would probably struggle to do it now. Okay, the next one is there's fears that China, and if China can do it, fundamentally anyone can do it, whether they're on our side or someone else's side. So if China's doing it, then you can probably guess the Americans are thinking about it or are already doing it as well. They're talking about basically containerised missiles. So you put a missile in a container, you can put it on any ship going anywhere in the world, call it bananas, or iPads, whatever you want. And you can then have this container somewhere in the world and launch missiles from it. So they're talking about you can have it on ships, you can have it on a fishing ship, you can have it in a port. And there was a US military person that was saying that they're worried that someone could basically, the example they gave was putting basically a shipping container in the port of Seattle. They can wait for the day they want to press the button. It just sits in the port, and then on the day you press the button, it can launch. And whether it's a warhead or an electromagnetic pulse, they can basically launch an attack to destroy either electronics, cities, whatever. If the example they used was Seattle, where there's a very large US submarine base. So they're basically saying you could neutralise all the submarines with an EMP and blow up some stuff, and no one's got anyone to fight back at. There's no one to target because it's come from your own country. You don't know who it was or where it was. You've just had your submarine yard fritzed and some other stuff attacked by missiles, and you've got no one to... You can hypothesise who it might have been, but it's not like it's a missile that's launched out of a silo in another country. They got to the point where you can even see examples of them. That was from a trade show a number of years ago. That you can put these things anywhere you want if you want to do some damage and activate them whenever you want. So the nice safe world that we live in is only safe as long as the people don't push any of the buttons. Because basically with modern technology, during the Cold War there was talk of mutually assured destruction. That we're any number of times past that these days, but it's we can have localized destruction that is basically undetectable, untrackable till it's happened, and that's a fairly worrying thing. Couldn't do a presentation on signs of the times without mentioning old mate Rona. So we've got an ever-changing situation with this. Every time we think we've got ahead of it, you can see I've put a few things up there. We get a new strain of it, and this virus is going to have political, economic, and social repercussions for years, decades. Will we ever get back to normal? No one knows, and it's very troubling for people. There's some awfully smart people I'm very grateful to that are doing their best in the medical world so that we can have Christmas this year. Fundamentally, we can go down to camp because of the advances and the benefits of medical technology. But then we get there's a new variant. Omicron came out. When Omicron came out, I was wondering why they were called it that, and there was some interesting. I thought it sounds a lot like something else. So for those who like Transformers, that's Unicron, who's different to Omicron. But that's Optimus Prime's twin brother, but he was bad, and he was known as the Lord of Chaos and the Planet Eater. So probably similar to the Corona. But yeah, that's Unicron, not Omicron. But we're in a very developed world, we're in a very lucky country, and we've still been significantly impacted. There's places around the world that are a lot less well off than we are, and even ignoring COVID, we've got an opioid epidemic, especially in the US. There's hundreds of people dying from opioid overdoses. Now, the third world, disease is rife. Despite all the wonderful things that we have in a medical world, we still don't seem to be able to have a healthy planet. So there's a lot going on. The pestilence that it talks about in those scriptures, it's not just one disease. There's, once we sort that out, someone will come up with another way for people to do damage to themselves. It's just kind of how we operate, it seems. Hunger, which is another thing that that block of scriptures talks about. So that's the hunger map from the World Food Programme. And that's talking about chronic hunger. That's not, I didn't quite get seconds because my kids are getting big and they ate all my seconds. That's people who are legitimately not eating enough every day consistently and are malnourished and very hungry. So there's some percentages down the bottom, but that's kind of the population. So red is over 35%, which is a horrific stat that anyone in this world, 35% of anyone in a country doesn't have enough food. And they're saying COVID's actually going to make that much better. They're talking about they're calling it food insecurity. So with COVID, we've got price inflation, we've got labour shortages, the price of fertiliser's gone through the roof, currencies are dropping. It's all stacking up. We can't move stuff around the world. Global supply lines are jammed up. So all of this is leading to, and when they're jammed up, that means you have to pay more to use them. So it now costs even, infinitely more to get food to the hungry people than it did before. So it's now an even harder task. There's less food and it's a lot more expensive. And the food prices going up impacts those with the least money the most. So it might be that we decide we're going to have one less coffee a week to cover the inflation. If you're already starving and don't have enough money and food prices go up, you're in a world of hurt. And that's something that will carry on after COVID drops down or whatever happens with COVID. Because of the delay, there's a time lapse in that if you haven't been in your farm for a whole season, at the moment we've got stuff in the stores, but then the next year there's nothing in the store. So there's actually a lag there where we'll see the food and other productivity issues hitting in years to come as the stockpiles dwindle and aren't replenished at the same rate that we're consuming them. So hunger's going to become, hunger's not going to go away. That's probably going to get worse, if anything. A bit closer to home, we have the Melbourne earthquake. So I think Mum and Dad survived. Probably put some cracks in their nice painted plasterboard, upset them, but it was the biggest earthquake in 200 years in Melbourne. I'm not sure who was measuring them 200 years ago. Don't know, Captain Cook had too many, earthquake people. He probably just went, oh, my cup's shaking, that's not good. All right, stop, let's get on with business. But I don't know how they say it's the biggest one for, you could say 1,000 years, no one knows. But at least 200. Melbourne, having spent 30 years there, Melbourne's not a city that expects earthquakes or anticipates them or is designed for them. And to get a magnitude 5.9 earthquake was a massive surprise. So in terms of earthquakes in strange places, Melbourne's fairly high up the list of places not expecting an earthquake. And that we see that written in that scripture, that we're going to see some of these strange things happening. And we've got another super serious one here. So just to show the state of the world, Canada has tapped its strategic reserves of maple syrup. That's true. I didn't know they had strategic reserves of maple syrup. I don't know our government's stockpiling Vegemite for an emergency, but they released 50 million pounds from their strategic maple syrup reserves because and that was about half their stockpile, because there was a shortage, and because of COVID there's been a down production. So even maple syrup's not safe from the turmoil in this world and the signs of the times. So when you're down at the pancake parlour, just think twice before you go too much, because it'll run out one day. All right, so there's the verses we read at the start, and I think if you skim through those, certainly kingdom against kingdom, earthquakes, famines, pestilences, fearful sights, and signs in the stars and the moon, perplexity and distress on the earth. I think we're ticking these boxes these days. Don't have to dig too hard or too deep to find these things, and I'm sure there's a lot more happening. Middle East seems to have gone a bit quiet. Things were getting a bit hectic earlier in the year with all the Hamas rockets, but that seems to have really wound down. But who knows when that's going to fire up again? The whole Middle East is a bit of a powder keg. Iran's talking nuclear weapons and things like that. So there's a lot going on still, but I think we can see that what the Lord was talking about is certainly upon us. So these are the verses out of Luke, and if we go to the next verse, there's something, I suppose, a bit more pleasant for us. It says, "And then they shall see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh." So that's what we're holding on to. That's what we're not so much glorying in the chaos on the previous slide, but this is the promise we've got, that the Lord's promised us eternal life and this great promise of ruling and reigning with Him and the return of Christ. So we'll leave it there, but yes, thanks.